You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. We're doing something a little different on the podcast today. I've been in the midst of writing my next journal/guidebook for this upcoming year. And so last year I did a whole journal for the hermit or for the whole entire year rather. And I got such wonderful feedback and encouragement to do another one. So I've been hard at work creating another journal/guidebook for 2026 as it relates to the Wheel of Fortune, because 2 + 0 + 2 + 6 = 10. If we're doing the numerology of the year, and 10 correlates to the Wheel of Fortune in tarot. And so I've been working on this journal with the Wheel of Fortune, and in doing so, I'm deconstructing the Wheel of Fortune. And I've had so much fun thinking about the different symbols and the elements of the card. And I figured, I should probably bring some of this energy to the podcast. So that's what we're going to do today. And we're going to explore the symbolism of the cloud. So if you shift your focus both above and below the Wheel of Fortune, past the actual wheel and all the spokes and the strange cast of characters that we will get to about this card that all kind of feel a little chaotic, you'll find something that's soft and kind of the framing and holding this card together. And those are clouds. And it's really interesting because each one cushions a winged figure. So we have the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel. And whether they're framing the scene or even like calling the four corners, if we want to get witchy about it, the clouds are super easy to overlook because there's really so much happening within the rest of the card. However, the symbolic meaning of the clouds is really what I believe anchors the entire meaning of the card. And I did like a whole deep dive on this. I was pulling out all my symbolism books and, researching, the history and the meaning of clouds throughout history and different cultures. And it all kind of bleeds together. And it seems like the clouds are a representation for mainly kind of the space between our earthly experience and then the unknown. And the unknown, I say the unknown specifically and not some people, depending on your beliefs, might be between, earth and the divine or, God or, whatever you might believe, or spirits, whatever feels right for you. I like using the word unknown because I feel like it encompasses so much more than just saying, between the earth and the divine. Because the unknown could also represent things that we don't know that are happening right here with us right now. And I feel like the clouds are a representation of kind of this liminal space, the knowing and the unknown, the ability to shape shift and transform and all of these things that we experience as humans. And, they become this backdrop against which the wheel turns, regardless of what's happening around it, which I think is actually really cool. The clouds they're not static, they're not stationary. They are ever changing, but they are not on the wheel, which I think is a fascinating observation. So believe it or not, clouds are actually elementally complex. On the surface, they're this combination of air and water. or symbolically thought and emotion. However, hidden within the contents of clouds, we also have just traces of the earth, stuff like dust and other kind of random particles. And then also the potential for fire, lightning. So what I've realized is, these, often luminous, wispy, fluffy, billowy, beautiful pieces of sky architecture are really kind of inconspicuously carrying all four life necessary elements. So I just mentioned how, these clouds are never static. They're always becoming something else. They're either dissolving or reshaping, drifting off into new spaces, merging with other clouds nearby. And as I was looking at this card and I was thinking about, the actual experience of clouds, I was also paying attention to how all four figures on the clouds are winged. And it got me wondering if maybe they had to or have just adapted and evolved to the need to stay afloat once their, kind of cloud raft, so to speak, shifts out from underneath them and dissolves or merges or moves or becomes smaller and can't hold them anymore. And it's this kind of like inherent mutability of the clouds that feels like a really important, maybe like counterpoint to the fixed nature of the four signs that are kind of cozied up within the clouds. Because all of the figures in the clouds are connected to zodiac signs, specifically fixed zodiac signs. And I think there's actually some tension there that's worth noticing or at least talking about for a moment. So the clouds, which are mutable, they're not fixed. They're ever changing, are kind of surrounded by or even holding the most fixed signs in astrology. So the bull is representation of Taurus, the lion, Leo, eagle, Scorpio, and then the angel is Aquarius. And we could look at this as saying, or as like the ultimate way of saying, really, nothing is immune to change and impermanence. So, we look at these signs as being fixed, but I think that seeing them up against the clouds is really interesting, especially winged, because we know that they are going to be forced to change and move in some way once the cloud shifts or dissolves or merges. They're going to have no choice but to figure out how to kind of exist in that space now. So as I was reading everything that I could find about clouds, it seems like in myth and just kind of like sacred stories, clouds are really seen as thresholds. We typically see them on proud display on mountaintops where, the story of a god descending would occur, or it kind of obscuring or acting as a veil against temples or, people or animals or images, and then kind of parting when we're ready to see or experience whatever it is that was hiding. And they've also been used to announce the arrival of something divine. And these clouds also function as both barriers, which I'll get into later in the episode when we talk more about different tarot cards, and also as an invitation. So in tarot, we see this kind of same liminal function in the aces where, this hand's kind of emerging from the clouds and, all the aces offering us a sword or a cup or a wand or a pentacle. And that imagery has always felt like this kind of perfect metaphor for those, kind of quote, out of nowhere moments, when we say that, oh, it just hit me out of nowhere, this idea or this inspiration, inspiration just struck me like a bolt of lightning. And, the clouds in the Wheel of Fortune carry a similar energy, except they're not necessarily delivering the gift of inspiration. Instead, they're kind of cradling the entities in which hold maybe valuable information that we might need. And, this is where it can get a little interesting because depending on your beliefs and your relationship to the cards, which is different for everybody. And if you have been listening to my podcast for a while or you follow my work, you know that I take a very secular approach to spirituality, to the cards. I'm very much looking at this through the lens of the human experience and relationships and psychology and therapy. So I'm looking at this, the holding of valuable information as, perhaps it's the collective unconscious, future pathways, things that we maybe subconsciously know, but haven't been able to consciously reach. Other people might say it represents the sacred truth, the divine, information that we cannot know until we are, on the other side, for example. So again, it really depends on your individual relationship to the cards, to these archetypes, and to the symbolic nature of all of these images in the cards. There's also a really fun psychological component that exists with the clouds in tarot. Clouds are just rife with their own metaphors. I mean, think about when we say things like, oh, your judgment is clouded, or, oh, they've got their head in the clouds again. Both of these phrases suggest having kind of distance between your ability to see really what's going on, kind of an obscured vision and denial, just like a level of not knowing or being oblivious to what's going on that maybe you should know. And this could be because of like confusion or idealism, being kind of aloof and not really present. But the clouds in the wheel also kind of speak to this in a way. So like when change is underway, we might not see the whole picture. And that could be because of, being aloof or not aware or just purposeful denial. And that's not necessarily a flaw. It's a part of being human. And I also think it's the nature of transition. We don't necessarily all welcome change with open arms. A lot of us want to resist it and push it away and not acknowledge it. And like I mentioned earlier, clouds are constantly, dissolving, drifting, shape-shifting, merging with each other. We never quite know what their final shape will be. In fact, there rarely is even a final shape or final product when it comes to clouds, which was really fascinating for me to sit with as someone who is so outcome oriented. I've spent, oh my God, probably at least the last decade and a half trying to not be so outcome oriented. But clouds just as a whole, their presence invites us to trust that kind of, natural shift that's going to happen, whether it's like a shift in perspective or a shift in environment, and to encourage us to kind of allow, to keep with this cloud metaphor, the weather of our psyche and the weather of the collective and the collective unconscious to change and shift without panicking that the fog will never lift or that that shift will somehow be permanent. Because it's so easy for us to get stuck in the thought that, whatever we are in this moment, whatever we are experiencing at this point in time is it. And that's just not true. Whenever, you find yourself worried that whatever life transition, either individually or collectively, is happening, is the end result, the final product, I really would encourage and invite you to step outside of that and look for the clouds. Like it is never the final product. Like if you are stuck in that space, like literally, quite literally, step outside, look up into the sky, find a cloud, and just sit with it for a moment. And over the next, few minutes, you will see that cloud has shifted and become something else. And of course, that change is not going to be as instantaneous with us, either individually or collectively, but nothing ever stays the same. When I was thinking about clouds specifically through the lens of the Wheel of Fortune, because I'm writing this guided journal, I was also kind of looking at them as an observer because they're surrounding the wheel. They're not on top of the wheel. They're not directly behind the wheel. They're not spinning with it. They're their own kind of freestanding entity experiencing their own natural shifts, but also they're kind of watching over the wheel. And with the clouds, there isn't this sense of urgency with them like there might be with the wheel itself. And in therapy, that's what I might refer to as, okay, we're going to be observant and mindful. We're going to tap into the observant, mindful self, the part of us that can witness our experiences or the current collective experience without getting swept up entirely into it and now not being able to function. The clouds kind of model a way of being present to and with change without being completely consumed by it. So I feel like there's like wisdom that exists there because, again, if we are consumed by the constant, sometimes abrupt, jarring, terrifying change that, often happens to us as humans, then we can't respond in a way that is actually meaningful or beneficial to ourselves or others. So when I'm talking about being a mindful observer, kind of as the clouds, I'm not suggesting we just watch change happen and, just see what comes of it. It's watching what's happening in a way that allows us to kind of fully be present and figure out how we want to respond in a way that is healthy, appropriate, and again, beneficial. Otherwise, if we're just wrapped up in it, then we can't respond at all. If we start looking at the kind of presence of clouds throughout the tarot, even beyond just the Wheel of Fortune, we start to see that they're way more than just kind of an artistic detail. I actually think they're pretty prominent parts of the entire story that's being told with the card, specifically the way they shift in texture, in position, and context. It really kind of mirrors the psychological landscape or experience that we're being invited to explore through that specific archetype. So in order to prepare for this episode, I went through the entire deck and I pulled out every single card that had a cloud in it. And I actually found myself intrigued to see which cards had clouds and which ones didn't. Because some of the cards that I would have expected to have clouds, that had, open, vast landscapes, like the Eight of Cups, for example, it had absolutely clear skies. And actually, just to spend a moment thinking about or talking about the Eight of Cups, that one really stood out to me because we look at that card as, kind of the walking away card. And to not have even one small cloud in the distance really tells me that this card represents like true kind of internal knowing, like this decision that you have made to leave. You know in every fiber of your being is what you're supposed to be doing. Like there's no illusion, there's no what if, there's no but you can also go do this other thing. It is true 100% commitment and knowing. There's zero distractions. So if you have the time and you are interested in this kind of thing, I absolutely encourage you. And I'm doing this through the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. So of course, it's probably very different for other decks. But just the traditional imagery, if you have that, I encourage you to pull out the cards and take a look for yourself and see how you even respond to the cards that don't have clouds versus the cards that do. So there's quite a few cards that do have clouds. And I do want to talk about all of them, but I'm going to kind of rapid fire go through them because I think, honestly, each card could be given its own, episode and platform and absolutely deserves that. So I'm just going to kind of like briefly go through and, say a couple thoughts about each card or a collection of cards. So speaking of a collection of cards, I'll start there. So every ace has a cloud in it, and the aces are probably the cards that we most associate with clouds because the clouds are attached to the hand. So, you kind of see this hand, pushing through a cloud, and then it's offering us, either a cup, a sword, a pentacle, or a wand. And what's fascinating is the rest of this being, whatever it is completely obscured. You cannot see it. So we have no idea who or what is offering us this item. It almost as if the offering is coming from, if we're going to keep the metaphor of like the liminal space of the clouds, like this space in between the seen and the unseen. And psychologically, this is kind of like the unconscious broaching consciousness. So the cloud would then kind of act as the threshold, suggesting that, new beginnings, new inspirations are rarely fully visible at first. Like we can't fully see, what this is or what this could be. They arrived kind of hazy or veiled, but we have to be open to seeing, what they are and what they could be. Which really brings me to the Four of Cups. So that's another card that I feel like when we think about clouds in the tarot is most prominent because in the Four of Cups, this hand is kind of extending from a cloud again. And this time it's, holding a cup towards someone who appears either unaware or disinterested or distracted. And I always kind of wonder, is this the Ace of Cups returning? And now it's being ignored. And this Four of Cups is a potential implication or showing an implication of what happens when an offering is neglected. And neglected maybe due to perception, our mood, preoccupation, anything that's kind of like preventing us from seeing it or being open to it. And I think that this is a reminder that opportunity, inspiration, whatever you want to assign to the aces, for example, is really about our willingness or capacity to notice, accept, and receive. So then we have the Seven of Cups. And another card that when we think of clouds probably pops up for a lot of us because all of these cups, all of these 7 cups are resting on really large, billowy clouds, each kind of holding a fantasy or depending on what's kind of going on, maybe some sort of ominous thing. And, the clouds themselves end up kind of acting as this pedestal for possibility, but also for illusion, which is something that a word we typically assign to the Seven of Cups. So, when our fantasies are clouded, represented by these literal clouds, it's easy to confuse them for reality. And then the Seven of Cups is kind of like asking us to really look at what's going on here and how can we discern between dreams, desires, fantasies that are healthy and inspire growth and well-being versus those that might, I don't know, have malice intent or be ominous illusions. I want to talk about a major now because there are some prominent major arcana cards that have clouds present within them. And one of them is the Lovers. And I'm actually going to talk about the Lovers through the lens of an actual relationship, which I rarely do with this card. So what's really fascinating about the cloud in this card is that it's kind of one singular cloud hovering between both of the figures here with the angel kind of resting on it, coming out of the cloud. And I find the positioning so fascinating because it's not entirely above them. It's not way off in the distance. It is very front and center, and it's lower to the ground, almost like at waist level with both of these people. And I couldn't help but look at it as kind of a barrier, but like a soft barrier. It's not like a wall or a rigid boundary. I think that it suggests maybe the presence of something unspoken, not fully seen between people. And this could be like romantic relationship, platonic relationship, like something that we can't see within this connection. And I think it's a reminder too that even in relationships, there's always going to be some level of mystery. Or, I mean, if we want to talk about relationship counseling, there should be some level of mystery because that's what keeps desire alive. But I think it also represents the illusion of our partner as well. And, needing to be mindful that we project our wishes and our desires onto our partner in hopes that they will be what we want them to be, which can then in turn cloud our ability to fully see them as they are. And that can always lead to problems. And that's a whole other episode in and of itself. I did talk about this, or kind of some of this idea recently when I was talking about the Two of Cups. So if you're interested in that, go check out that episode. Another major that has clouds is Judgment. And of course, it's the same kind of imagery that we see in the Lovers, with the angel kind of emerging from the cloud, forming that pedestal. It's their trumpet call. And the cloud here is more of like a stage for awakening, kind of that platform between maybe mortality, transcendence. And, I'm thinking about this, especially with what we know the Judgment card to represent is, perhaps this is like a representation of the final act, that self-actualization, that truth, where, we are kind of inching towards that. We haven't like fully gotten there yet, but we're getting closer. And then, of course, the world and the Wheel of Fortune. So I've talked about the Wheel of Fortune at length, but the world is interesting when we think about it, connecting to the Wheel of Fortune, because both cards frame this kind of central image with the four clouds in the corners, with those same fixed zodiac signs represented by the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel. All kind of like cradled in the clouds. In the wheel, the clouds are a little bit more dynamic. They're a little bit more visible and a little bit more billowy, larger. Whereas in the world, they're a little bit smaller, a little bit calmer. They're not really kind of attention grabby as they would be in the Wheel of Fortune, which I think is really interesting. The world in essence really is, kind of this integration, individuation, completion card. So it would make sense that the clouds are not going to be too prominent. And I think that is because it's a reminder that kind of like, whatever forces we feel like are kind of present with us or guiding us through change are also going to be present during these moments of individuation, fulfillment, endings. And I think it's also a reminder that we have to look at kind of where we've been to get to really be present in and appreciate kind of where we are right now. So I feel like the world is where we start to see kind of a shift in the look and the style of clouds. And in the next few cards I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about them because they specifically kind of look different than the clouds and the rest of the tarot. So, for example, the Three of Swords. So we still see kind of like a large cloud and, with the kind of soft, billowy outlines. But now they're weeping and they're dark. And of course, this could be a representation of either direct or indirect expressions of grief and sadness and pain. But this time they're not concealed like, other kind of emotions and other cards might be. And from a psychological perspective, I think this is kind of an invitation to allow this release of emotions, like allowing your sadness and your sorrow and your grief and your pain to be seen and to be felt, because we have to release it. Otherwise it gets stuck. So then if we move on to some court cards, specifically the King and Queen of Swords, along with the Page of Swords, we see something a little different. With the Page of Swords, there isn't too much of a shift in the style of the clouds. They're still kind of billowy, but they're a lot more, and the positioning is different than the rest of the tarot. It almost kind of like all consuming with the Page of Swords. So could be, a reflection of a lot of uncertainty still, because this is a page. With the King and Queen of Swords, again, not too much change in the style of the clouds, but the positioning is very different. So with these cards, the clouds are kind of like below and behind or to the side of them, kind of suggesting that, these thrones that they're sitting on are actually kind of rising above the fog. So they're reaching a state of clarity and, certain perspective. So now we move to the cards that are very different. So the 5, 10, and Knight of Swords completely lose that like billowy softness. They become really jagged, they're fragmented, which I think really fits with the meaning of the cards. I think it becomes an artistic representation of the mental turbulence, the inner conflict, possible destruction, whereas there's kind of this like pleasantness about the clouds in other cards that has kind of given way to maybe harsher or sharper realities where, the clouds are not as cushiony and inviting, and now they look kind of ominous. And now the card that you would think the clouds would look the most ominous in, the Tower, they actually don't look as ominous. I feel like in the 5, 10, and Knight of Swords is when they look most uninviting. In the Tower, the clouds are still kind of jaggedy. They're not very big, but they don't appear as aggressive as the clouds in the 5, 10, and Knight of Swords. So it could be that, they're just there as witnesses to this like sudden upheaval. They were in the process of transition, but then, or merging or dissolving, as clouds do. But the upheaval happened so abruptly and so quickly without any sort of warning that they are kind of like residual leftover, and just kind of there. And I actually really like that because I think that it points to this like, obviously disruption and the clouds aren't dominating the scene, but I think you could really kind of dive in there and do some analysis of how the cards appear in the tarot, given kind of what's going on and why wouldn't they look like the clouds in the 5, 10, and Knight of Swords. And I think that speaks directly to the just like suddenness of the Tower, which, at the end of the day, I think is a true testament to the fact that no one thing is ever in control or can ever truly predict what's going to happen at any given moment. All right. So this episode was really fun for me. I hope that you all enjoyed it. There's obviously so much more to be said about these cloudy cards, but that's all I've got for now. Thank you so much for listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow the Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.